Thank you very much. Ian, can you hear me at the back okay? Yes. All loud and clear, right, that's good. And thank you all for coming along. I thought it was best just to start with a little bit of background to Richard Hayward in a few minutes. I have a slideshow here, but I've got a DVD first of all that we're going to play. It's just a reflection of some of Richard Hayward's singing, dancing, acting, and many of the cultural activities that he was involved with. Did any of you see the BBC television documentary on Tuesday night?
Yeah.
That's okay, you can go now then. This is slightly different because it's more just compartmentalising the sides of his life in a different way to the television documentary. But it's reflecting the many different sides of the man and what he did. So we're going to kill the lights now and play the DVD first. This is about 6 minutes or so. And then we'll move into the slideshow after that. So, are we ready? Where's this?
Let them go, let them tarry, let them sink or let them swim. He doesn't care for me and I don't care for him. You can go and get another and I hope he will enjoy. But Ryan's going to marry a far nicer boy.
You're hypocrite, you and your flowers, and your courtship for young men, and your hat pinned up at the sideways. I'm glad you took the pin out of your hat anyway. Who is she, eh? Who is she?
Who is she? It's a thing, a book. It's neither a he nor a she.
You're smart, aren't you? None of your shilly-shallying with me. Who is she?
Half you forever scout. If you come from Ireland, sure it's certain you must know that when we have the hoolie, it's a real old-fashioned show. For the hooli's not a picnic, nor a party, nor a ball, but it's all in three together and an open door for night we do the hoolie and we knock about the door. Sure the dancing was the bishop and the girls are full of joy. The hoolie never rested and the night was in the sun. And the Mickey said we were so sure it's time to have a run. Sure, no one would be dying because the men began to feel. And if the piper stopped to tell the would not get a meal. And when you get the dog of girl, that's somebody joy. And night the hoolie down in other valleys. You can travel Old Ireland from Antrim to Kerry, and not find a spot like the town of Coleraine. The boys and the girls never seem there to alter. You go where you like, you're there always the same. And if ever you're wanting a right hearty welcome, just come to the sweet little town of Coleraine. I'd roam through recreation, new comforts to find still, but the comfort I would seek the most, you all may understand, is to win the hand of Martha. She's the flower of sweet Strabane. One day down in Bangor I called on Miss Brown. She was up in her bath so she couldn't come down. Says I slip on something and come down quick. So she slipped on the soap and was down in the tick. Tra-la-la, tra-la-lee, over 6 miles from Bangor to Donaghadee. One day at the market I bought a wee hen. I thought I would like a fresh egg now and then, but the very next morning I got a great shock. Says the hen, I can't lay, sure I'm only a cock. Tra-la-la, tra-la-lee, over 6 miles from Bangor to Donaghadee. One day I was walking down the main street. I saw a wee lad with no shoes to his feet. I took pity on him then and there, and went into a fruit shop and bought him a pear. Tra-la-la, tra-la-lee, over 6 miles from Bangor to Donaghadee. I once met a man with a hole in his head. They took out my brain for to mend it, he said. The
That's awkward, says I, but says he, not at all. Sure, I'm only a deputy up in the door. Tra-la-la, tra-la-lee, over 6 miles from Bangor to Donaghy. I met an old man at a funeral one day. His back it was stooped and his hair it was grey. I'm close on 100, he said with a groan. They said you'd be wasting your time to go home. Tra-la-la, tra-la-lee, over 6 miles from Bangor to Donaghy. I dreamt I did die and to heaven did go, and the place that I came from they wanted to know. Says I'm from Bangor, St. Peter did stare. Hurry up, step inside, you're the first one from there. Tra-la-la, tra-la-lee, over 6 miles from Bangor to Donaghy.
There we are, you'll be singing along all afternoon and evening, no doubt, to yourselves. Some of the artistry of Richard Hayward, playing the harp, singing, dancing. A man of many talents and a man of many parts. We're going to start the slideshow now, and I can call this up. I just wanted to mention one thing. Minimize that one. Just going to mention one thing because not everybody will be able to stay to the end today. Can you hear me okay there? Next Friday, this day week, the Lynn Hall Library is running a symposium. That's a full day of talks on Richard Hayward. You might have had enough after today, but I won't be showing this slideshow. We have 5 or 6 different speakers coming from all parts of Ireland, and they'll be discussing his filmmaking, his singing, his dialect collecting, his travel writing. There's a panel discussion on his travel writing and his theatrical work. So it's going to be a full day. It's all completely free. You're welcome along. You can dip in for an hour or 2 if you wish and leave. You don't have to stay all day, but it is going to be a great day, a veritable feast of Richard Hayward next Friday. On the Saturday morning, there will be a Richard Hayward walking tour of central Belfast in his footsteps. And you're welcome along in that if any of you wish to come. You do need to book it in advance through the Lynn Hall Library, and you should really book a place by phoning them if you want to go to the symposium. It's completely free all day and on the Saturday morning walking tour. So I thought I would just mention that now before we move on. I'm going to start with some context with Richard Hayward's background. So just for a few minutes.
If you want to.
Okay.
Like that one?
All right. It is on okay, but it says mute. But is that a problem? Is this better? Okay. I'll not go over the Lynn Hall Library Symposium details again. Everybody should have got one of these, so take that away, and there's more. Bring one to a friend. I'm going to start with some context dealing with Richard Hayward's background. So just for a few minutes, we'll look at where he came from, and let's see. I think it is, in a sense, a somewhat unprepossessing start to the story of his life. Hayward's ancestors, his grandfather ran a foundry in London in the mid-19th century that made these manhole covers. He didn't come out of a hole in the ground, by the way. He had a natural birth, but they can still be seen today in parts of Britain and Ireland. Hayward brothers, William and Edward, started as glaziers in the late 18th century, and then they bought an ironmongery business where they ran their foundry at Union Street in Borough in London, and they expanded into making coal plates, manhole covers and pavement lights. There's a large cluster of pavement lights in central Dublin opposite Trinity College in College Street, and this particular one is off Grafton Street in Ann Street South. You can't really see it, but it's Hayward Brothers, it says it there in the foreground. There's a particularly fine specimen of them in Galway at the Victoria Hotel, which is just off Eyre Square. The glazed glass allows light into the basement, and it's found in inside this hotel and outside it. So the son then of one of the brothers was Walter Hayward, who was involved in engineering and moved to live in Southport, Lancashire, which is where his son, Richard, was born in 1892. and 3 years later they moved to Ireland. Walter Hayward ran a marine engineering works in Belfast, but his big interest was sailing, and he was one of England's leading yachtsmen. He was a member of many clubs, including the Royal Mersey in Liverpool, and in this shot he's wearing his Mersey Yacht Club badge featuring a liver bird, the symbol of Liverpool. His wife, Louise Eleanor, this is Richard's mother, known as Louis or Ivy, was a busy woman. They had 6 children, 5 boys and a girl, so she had her hands full bringing up the family. She was the daughter of a silk merchant and came from a fairly well-heeled family. But Walter Hayward himself was quite a dashing figure. With his handlebar moustache, he comes across as a very confident man, perpetually busy, mixing business with his passion for boats. And as well as being a sailor, he was a huntsman and an active member of the New Ross Harriers and Foxhounds Club. He was also a fine shot and a swordsman. And he was renowned for his organisational ability in forming new clubs, and was responsible for the design of a number of open boats and small yachts, as well as fishing boats and motor yachts. He also worked for the Congested Districts Board in the west of Ireland between 1906 and 1909, mostly in Donegal, helping fishermen modernise their boats and installing motors in them. The boats had been very basic around this time, so he brought some relief to the industry. And it's curious that although he had 5 sons, his sailing passion was passed on only to his daughter Gladys, and she was a very accomplished helmswoman. She was one of the few British women to gain national recognition as competitive helms before 1914, and this shot is taken off the sailing together in Belfast Loch around the early 1900s. That's a little background. On to the main man now, the main boy. This is Richard Hayward, aged 4, taking on a bad hair day, you might say, shortly after they moved to Ireland. Probably fashionable in those days. He's wearing his sailor boy outfit and yacht. So the family firstly moved to Omeath in County Louth, and then they moved to Larne. His father wanted to be near Belfast Loch to join the sailing clubs, although Richard didn't sail himself. As a teenager he was interested in boats, though, and he was taken on many boating holidays, especially on the inland waterways with his father, on one occasion from Belfast Loch to Fermanagh on the Erne, and this stimulated an early interest in waterways, leading to a love of the Shannon in later life. This is the street where he lived as a boy, Chelmsford Place in Larne, a cul-de-sac at Sandy Bay, right beside the waterfront. And Larne in those days was a small town, but it was a very busy place, and it attracted many tourists because of the boat connections and the mail and passenger steamers to Scotland. And the tours then were also starting to open up the Northampton coast and the Giant's Causeway. One of the main operators was Henry McNeill, a hotelier and a tourism pioneer. And this postcard just shows the lively scene with the tour parties gathering in the 1890s when he was a boy. Larne was quite a rambunctious place, probably still is today. I know there's a few Larne people here. But it was, there was a sort of a raffish air to it, and it attracted visitors and this never-ending stream of travellers. The streets were crowded and children loved the rag-bag assortment of characters. Many years later, in his first travel book, Hayward described it as a place of religious fanatics, ballad singers, dancers, tramps, naturals and clowns, all in a motley crowd, no doubt attracted by the custom and largesse of Larne's growing tourist traffic. And all of this had a very big impact on him, and you couldn't really overstate the importance of Larne to him as a boy growing up. He heard Percy French singing on the streets at one of the fair days, and he enjoyed exploring the countryside too. But it was at their house that he had heard a maidservant singing in Irish, and the maid came from Ballybay in County Monaghan, and as a boy of 7 he listened to her singing in Irish and in English. And this is just one of the street scenes in Larne. So she sang songs like the Owl Leather Breeches, the Fair of a Thigh and Sweet Mary Acklam. And this stirred a great love for him at the age of 7 in traditional Irish music, and was something that he went on to develop. Just a little side curiosity about his background. Although he was born in England, he tried to disguise this fact. This is a passport from later years for Richard and his wife Elma, which states that he was born in Southport in 1892. But in another passport, he gives his place of birth as Larne in October 1893. Why should this be? We don't really know the answer. Part of the enigma of the man, more than anything else. But he did seem to, having a bit of fun perhaps, but he wanted to disguise his English background, the fact that he was English born, even though he only lived there as a baby, until about 2 really, when they moved. I wrote a piece for the BBC online website last week, and I made the point that he wanted to disguise his English background, and somebody changed it to say disguise his English accent. Not sure how strong that would have been at the age of 2. But anyway, I like the solid documentary proof. And this is his birth certificate. The conclusive proof saying he was born at 21 Forest Road, Southport on October the 24th, 1892. This is an Edwardian Hayward family portrait from 1906. Standing in the back row from left to right are Charles, Basil and Rex. And then seated left to right are Richard, aged 14, their father Walter, Gladys, mother Ivy, and the youngest child Casement, then aged 7. Richard and his brothers were educated at Larne Grammar School, and by the time he attended, the family had moved to live at Silverstream in Green Island. So he was a boarder there, and he wrote about an initiation ceremony in one of his Ulster travel books at the school. This involved being grasped by senior boys and having his head held in a place never intended for such a purpose. And then he describes what it was like as he waited for the chain being pulled and the eventual roar and rush of water. The fun of boarding school life. But he survived it all. He was very interested in literature and drama at school, and it was a very good school, promoting that in those days when he was there, around the turn of the century, early 1900s. His family was quite sporting. The Haywards made up nearly half of the Silverstream hockey team in the early years of the 20th century. But Richard didn't take part in these games. He was quite independent-minded and did his own thing, mostly listening to a phonograph that he got as a teenager. But when I say they made up half this team, that's Walter in the back left. His brothers are there, and Gladys. So there's 6 Haywards in that team. In his late teenage years then, he got to know Belfast, and one of the sights that he witnessed was the building of the Titanic, which, as you all know, would have been the big talking point for several years at that time. And after school, he began studying naval architecture, but his first job was in Liverpool at the Camel Laird shipyard. But on the 31st of May, 1911, he was still in Belfast, where he watched the launch of the Titanic from the top of the Albert Clock. Quite a spectacle. There were tens of thousands of people on the streets, and he had met the caretaker of the Albert Clock, who invited him to come up to the top to watch this amazing spectacle. It was launched on its sea trials and for fitting out. Its maiden voyage was in April the following year. He later described the event as epoch-making and epoch-annihilating, and an era of smug self-sufficiency. We're going to move on now to the next section, which is his drama and broadcasting. And this was a very big slice of his life in the 1920s and 30s. And there's many different sides to this, because he was manager of the Ulster Players during the 1920s. He was involved in the Belfast Radio Players in the BBC when they opened 90 years ago. And then he set up to form his own Belfast repertory company. So this section deals with some of those. There might be a slight overlap, because that's the way his career and life worked. His wife Elma was a member of the Belfast Radio Players. She was a very talented actress and appeared alongside her husband in stage plays and later in films. She was a very good mimic, and she was involved in the repertory company as well as the radio plays with the BBC right from the start. So here we see Richard Hayward, centre stage, seated in the centre in the front there, the BBC concert party in Belfast in 1925, outside the original studio in Linnenhall Street. The cast was rehearsing one of the most popular sketches, A Trip to the Isle of Man. I'll not go through all the names in this, but the man on the extreme right of the picture in the white shirt is Jerome Guthrie, who of course became an internationally renowned theatre director at Sadler's Wells. He'd just come down from Oxford at the age of 24 and worked very closely with Hayward. Richard was also a theatrical impresario and playwright, but he was better known as an actor, and he's seen here playing the part of Holy Joe in Charles K. Ayres' comedy Loaves and Fishes at the Gaiety Theatre in Dublin in 1921. And when you think of what was going on in Dublin around 1920, 21, 22, life still continued. People wanted escapism, they wanted the theatre, and he was very popular in these roles at that period with the Ulster Players. This was his play, The Jew's Fiddle, a one-act play jointly written by him and Abram Risch and published in 1921, and it was performed in both Belfast and Dublin, and it helped establish his credentials in the drama world. These are the actors from the Ulster Players strolling through St Stephen's Green, Dublin in 1923, and they were performing in Rutherford Main's Phantoms at the Gaiety for a week. Hayward's the second from the right. And we move on to this is the original BBC building in Linnenhall Street, where he recorded his radio plays and sketches with Jerome Guthrie. It was a former linen warehouse, and it was described by some as ugly, ill-shaped and most undignified. It was a very basic setup, and Guthrie called them crusaders of the ether, and he said no one was listening. To understand Richard Hayward, you have to put yourself back in the context of the times. In 1924, very few people would have had crystal sets. It was 2 or 3 years before they came in and before radio did take off, so probably very few people were listening at the start. The actress Cicely Matthews was one of the presenters of the popular Children's Corner radio programme, with which Hayward was also involved. He was known as Uncle Richard. And as well as singing, he told legends and stories. But a new station director, Gerald Beadle, came in and abolished these silly terms of aunt and uncle labels, so they got rid of those fairly soon. One of the biggest shows that Hayward staged was from the Empire in Belfast, and this was the first all-Ireland theatre relay broadcast called Hip Hip Hoo Radio. It was a musical comedy review by the Belfast Radio Players, and this is a signed copy of it. The performance was transmitted on the 13th of December 1927 via Dublin to Cork, simultaneously linking up the Lord Mayors in stations in each city who greeted each other over the airwaves, which is quite amazing just 5 years after the partitioning of the country. The Empire Theatre in Belfast, which was in Victoria Square, this was where he staged his relay review, and it was also the scene of many of his theatrical triumphs during the 1930s. Hayward took on and staged the work of Thomas Carnduff, the unemployed shipyard worker who wrote poetry and plays. And the plays reflected the gritty realism of working class Belfast life. The first one was called Workers. It was a very big success at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin and at the Empire. And the critics, newspaper critics in Dublin, made comparisons with the realism of Sean O'Casey. So it was extremely popular what he was doing, taking on these plays. During the war, the new BBC building opened, but broadcasting had effectively closed. The ground floor windows were bricked up. This was May 1941. On the left was a water tank, and on the right an air raid shelter outside the front door on Ormeau Avenue. Richard Hayward continued to work there and started his singing career. But just to go back briefly to the Carnduff connection, this was the historical drama Castlereagh that was set in the summer of the 1798 uprising. Lord Castlereagh was the Secretary for Ireland, and he put down the rising. The play was Carnduff's final work for his repertory company, Hayward's Repertory Company, and it enjoyed a very successful run early in 1935 at both the Empire and the Abbey Theatres. Richard Hayward was quite clever because he could always spot a little gap or a niche in the market, so to speak, the culture market. The Abbey Players took their groups to the United States for a week or two each year, so he brought down his Ulster Players to fill that hole. And you know, he saw the business opportunity to do that. Richard and Elma are playing the part here of Lord and Lady Castlereagh. Hayward's performance as Lord Castlereagh divided the critics. The Irish Times said he did not emerge with sufficient sharpness, while the Irish press critic felt he expressed every subtlety of mood. His manner and speech were always in character and in period. So generally he was well thought of by the critics as a subtle character actor in most cases, and you know, his drama world and the theatrical world has been largely forgotten, but he was one of the leading actors of his time. Another shot of the BBC in Belfast from the 50s, when Hayward was a regular visitor. It was in this building in 1957 that he recorded an LP called Words and Music of Ireland with Sean Maguire, the great fiddle player and piper, whose father had come from Cavan. So we'll go on, that takes us on to his music now, and we heard a flavour of it earlier there, playing the harp and his singing. And we have to go back really to the 1920s. Hayward sang both traditional Irish songs and orange ballads. He covered the spectrum. We'll talk a little bit about the orange songs later. But it was during a rehearsal for a BBC radio play in 1925 when he was asked by Jerome Guthrie to stand in for a singer who hadn't turned up, that his career took off, and Guthrie liked him so much he signed him up for the real thing. By that stage though, he had been collecting songs for some years, and Ulster Songs and Ballads is his anthology that came out in 1925. This is made up of 55 traditional songs that he collected and set down. He picked them up in his travels all over Ulster and further afield. He would have attended Céilís, concerts, he might have got them in pubs or wakes. He once said he never missed a chance to go to a good wake, and there was something wrong if he didn't come away with a couple of new songs. From 1929 then he started singing and recording mostly with Decca in London, and these were songs he had set down and arranged for himself. This is a list, you probably can't read them all, but it gives you an idea of the scale of it. So by the end of 1933, after 5 years with Decca, he had recorded more than 100 songs, many with orchestral accompaniment. Compton Mcentee described his work as the best bit of genre singing that the gramophone has ever given us. And along with Elma and Jimmy McGeehan, who was a very well-known actor at the time and had been with them in the repertory company and the Players, he recorded a series of popular comedy sketches in Ulster dialect. And in a break from the singing, he also recorded monologues with some other actors. These included a two-part speech recording, Hands Across the Border. We'll be playing that next Friday at the Symposium. It's a funny skit about the border with the Dublin actors and comedians Jimmy O'Dea and Harry O'Donovan. Just back to Larne briefly, this is William Law's shop. And this shop was a great promoter of his songs and films. This record shows the Old Larne Fair, a song that he enjoyed singing on later visits to the town. He always went back to Larne. Maybe he was speaking at the Grammar School Prize Day, or he was giving a talk to organisations, but he never really lost his connection to Larne, unlike Southport. This is a sheet music book, Ireland Calling, published in 1935 by Mozart Allen of Glasgow. Included some of his best known songs for community singing. But probably the best known and the most famous side of his singing career was teaming up with Delia Murphy. Some of you will have heard of her, I'm sure. It was at a meeting of the Dublin Centre of PEN, which is the writing organisation, that Hayward first discovered her singing. Delia Murphy was known as the Queen of Connemara, and they enjoyed a fruitful 4-year partnership performing on stage together. One of his many roles was a talent scout for Decca, and when he heard her singing, he immediately signed her up and passed on the details to Decca. And so he first discovered her and brought her to the attention of HMV. It was actually HMV, but she did stuff with Decca too. And they were extremely popular, singing all around the country. Delia Murphy's husband was the top man in Radio Erin, Tom Kiernan, who later became an Irish ambassador. So they got a few slots on Radio Erin as well. This is Waltons of Dublin, who published some of his sheet music, including The Three Flowers, a Norman Redden song, which Hayward arranged and recorded with Anna Meakin. He sang widely with Anna Meakin as well. During the Second World War, he was a regular entertainer on the Dublin stage, and his song and dance show was called A Spot of Irish, and it ran for 2 weeks in March 1941. This is the Guild, this is Anna Meakin again. They call themselves the Irish Troubadours, and again, very, very popular all over Ireland. This is the Guildhall in Derry, seen from the city walls from Shipquay Street. It was chosen as the sleeve colour photograph for Hayward's This Is Ireland, released by Fontana in the late 1940s. And another of his album covers is From the Irish Roads, produced by Decca in 1948 with the eponymous Richard Hayward Orchestra. I'm not sure where he got them all from, but it sounds impressive. The man on the left of the picture here is Henry Hall, the celebrated band leader. And they're discussing the latest HMV recordings shortly after the company opened their Irish manufacturing base in Waterford in 1936. They were keen to get more Irish singers on their books. Hayward, in a sense, was in the right place at the right time, and he was lucky in some respects at being around for these activities in terms of being signed up for them. Just to give you an idea, this is a Decca Music Review from 1950 featuring a rather young Frankie Vaughan, as well as Vera Lynn and Lee Lawrence, alongside Hayward, who that year recorded the Garden Mother's Lullaby and the Castle of Dromore. He wasn't singing with them, but he may have come across them in the cultural milieu of the time. Irish Saturday Night was released by Decca in 1954. It includes some of his best loved songs, such as Down in Glasloch, Nora Lee, Little Bridget Flynn, and the Girls of Coleraine, whom we saw earlier. He always had a bit of an eye for the lassies from Coleraine. He was very emotionally engaged with his work and very comfortable in front of a microphone. He was described by one critic as a master of his art. Some of his singing was a bit of showbiz. Other critics felt he didn't possess a great singing voice, but it was clear, it was pleasant to listen to, it was easy on the ear, it was illustrative of the entertainment culture from that period. He wasn't in the league of John McCormack or that sort of league, but he was extremely popular, and anybody who can record over 150 songs with Decca, I feel, has to be given his dues and credit where it is due. We see him here in characteristic pose playing the harp. He was taught to play the harp by two nuns at a convent in Lisburn. He had a very strong performance gene, and this urge to perform always. Some of it was a bit of showboating when it involved playing the harp, and this is actually his own, the Richard Hayward Harp, an historic harp which he presented to the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin in 1947. And he took great delight in telling people that the Irish translation on the harp reads, "May you never want a string while there's guts in an Englishman." That's from an Englishman originally, of course. Some more water for a second. He liked a bit of humour, he liked a bit of fun, and that was all part of the package that you got. We're going to look at his feature films and acting career in the big screen. Some of you may have seen The Luck of the Irish. Could you put your hand up if you saw it on Sunday night? You pressed your red button. Only one person?
We saw the start. It was
Saw the start. You had enough at that stage, had you?
No. We saw the Glen.
Well, it was a one-off screening that the BBC got permission to use once only. But to me it was amazing. The first time in 80 years it's ever been shown on television. I had seen snatches of it before, but I'd actually never seen the whole film. Luck of the Irish was his first major one, shot in 1935 at Glynn, near Larne, as you know, attracting much attention from locals. In fact, extra police had to be called in from Larne to regulate the traffic. Well, one extra policeman, I think. Never let the facts get in the way. You have to, again, put yourself in the context of the times. Imagine people had never seen these films being made. This was the first black and white talkies, as they were called, ever made, certainly in the north of Ireland. There had been a couple of films made in Kerry a few years earlier, but it was it was an amazing curiosity. What is all this about? Who are these actors? Look at all the equipment they have. So it did attract a lot of interest. Hayward played the part of Sam Mulhern, the village factotum, and in this scene they're toasting their luck in a communal sing-song to celebrate a horse they backed that won the Grand National at Aintree. Some of it was filmed at Castle Upton in Templepatrick, and those of you who did see the documentary will know Dan Gordon went back to Castle Upton to look at how the scenes had changed. It was a wonderful comparison between 80 years ago and today. As well as the singing roles, his other areas of acting included in this film bus office agent, gamekeeper and water bailiff. And it marked a breakthrough in his film career and in his transition from stage to screen. He was now leaving the drama world behind, moving onto the big screen. He's on the right of the picture here with Jimmy McGeehan, his great friend, enjoying a glass of whisky and Luck of the Irish. McGeehan appeared with him in radio plays and an actor with the Ulster Players, and he set up the repertory company with Hayward in 1929 when they broke away from the Ulster Players. The film was widely acclaimed by the critics in Ireland. Hayward was hailed by the Irish press as a soaring star, and the Irish Independent said it was an outstanding success. So it did help make him the break into the film world. This is just the Belfast Picture House. You can see how popular it was, the queue forming there in February 1936. And back to Larne briefly, Law's shop, a bit of window dressing at Larne to promote the film at the Picture House there, April 1936, and some of his stills alongside it. His second feature film was a comedy called The Early Bird, and this had a matchmaking theme, and it was released at the end of 1936. The promotional material mentioned Charlotte Tedley, who had been an actress in his other ventures. And the film was set in the fictional village of Ballytober. The location was again the Antrim coast, with Glenarm and Carnlough chosen as the villages for filming. So he was a great promoter of the Antrim coastline, and that's where he filmed. 3 of his films were made there. And it was, you know, something he always wanted to do to promote that area. He took on the central role of Daniel Duff, a farmer. You have to remember these were low-budget films, bucolic in a sense. Humour was the keynote in many of them. It was described by Hayward as a well-constructed comedy on robust country lines that made use of a matchmaking theme. One of his songs from this was The Muttonburn Stream, will be known to some of you I'm sure. It became a party piece of his. But the film wasn't to everyone's taste. The Irish Film Censor's report, this is just a copy of it, I've put it up to give you a flavour. You can't really read it, I'm sure, but it said that The Early Bird was crude and vulgar. And he asked for cuts before its release in the Free State. The report was by Ireland's first film censor, James Montgomery, and it stated that the amount given to men in their shirts is disgusting. It is no credit to Ireland to release such stuff. James Montgomery was quoted once as saying, "I take the 10 Commandments as my code." But it didn't stop it being successful, and box office records were set in parts of Ireland after the release of The Early Bird. In some places it was retained for an extra week. The distributors, the Irish International Film Agency, reported a record week in Dingle in Kerry, and box office records were broken in Carlow and Galway. And in Dublin, he was described as a famous Irish film star, and it played to packed houses and cinemas and at the Theatre Royal. It was shown as part of a popular cine variety performance. This was very well known at the time in the 1940s, late 30s and 40s. And you can see it was very well advertised and promoted. He was very aware of the value of publicity. And I think in a way, if the censor didn't like it, let's face it, probably most books, films and so forth that came out at that time were banned or were censored. He might have regarded that as a badge of honour, and if not, a little bit of publicity for his film. Anyway, his next one was Irish and Proud of It. This was his third major feature film, and it was filmed in County Louth, and it starred a newly discovered English actress called Dinah Sheridan, who was just 15, and she took on the lead role in it. Hayward switched from his rustic role to play the part of a dapper London Irish businessman, and you can see him here sharing a tender moment with Dinah Sheridan. Ballyvareen was the fictional village of Clogherhead in Louth that was used for filming the post office scene. It's quite a convoluted plot. I'll not go into it now, but there's a few humorous scenes. This is Hayward, Miles, Marwin and Gwen Gill featured in this image. But it was unquestionably Dinah Sheridan, the quintessential English Rose, who stole the show in the film. And she came to prominence after appearing in it. She went on to appear in Genevieve in 1953 and The Railway Children. She was the mother of the children in 1970. Hayward claimed that he discovered her, so that was Delia Murphy and Dinah Sheridan, not bad going. He later described her as a joy to work with, painstaking, adaptable, extremely biddable, highly talented and cheerful. She died in November 2012, and she got major obituaries in the British press, including half pages in the Times, the Guardian and the Daily Telegraph, where Irish and Proud of It got an honourable if brief mention. Richard Hayward did not get a mention. The reason she didn't get a full page is that Larry Hagman, remember him, JR of Dallas fame, also died, and he'd got an obituary that day as well, so he stole a bit of her thunder. The filming of his final feature, Devil's Rock, took place at Cushendun on the Antrim coast in the summer of 1937. Hayward again assumed the role of Sam Mulhern, and is pictured here with 10-year-old Gloria Granger on the beach. I don't know what happened to her, mind you, some of you might know. The queue at Belfast Cinema for Devil's Rock shows how popular it was. It was an hour-long romantic drama in which he starred alongside Geraldine Mitchell of the Gate Theatre in Dublin and Michael Gleeson from Limerick. One of the other actors was Tom Casement. He was a brother of Roger Casement, who was executed for treason and who frequently had visited North Antrim. This is just a publicity shot, really, a character pose for Devil's Rock. It was his least successful film, at least in terms of what the critics thought about it, if we care about them. His public liked him, and that was all that really mattered, I suppose. But the Belfast Telegraph said it was unsophisticated in the extreme. The Daily Express dismissed it, saying it was unlikely to achieve commercial success, as the story was poor, the continuity slipshod, and the whole atmosphere unreal. So his acting role in films came to an end pretty much after that, apart from one brief cameo appearance in the Titanic film A Night to Remember in 1958 with William Mcentee, whom he's seen with here. Hayward was a victualling superintendent in the film. He collected the tickets from those boarding. And it was made at a fraction of the cost, of course, of James Cameron's multi-Oscar winning 1997 Hollywood blockbuster, but it's regarded by the critics as being truer to the facts and without the film world glitz. During the Second World War, he made a film for the Irish government about bread, and he's pictured here on the front page of the Irish press discussing it with Eamon de Valera, who was the Taoiseach. It was called Tomorrow's Bread, and it was in fact it was a fact-based government information film encouraging farmers to grow more wheat, and was filmed mostly in County Kilkenny. You can maybe see lurking in the middle of the picture is Sean Mcentee. He was the Minister for Local Government. He was born in Belfast and took part in the Easter Rising, for which he was sentenced to death, although this was later commuted. But he was one of a small number of Northerners in the First Dáil, and he opposed the treaty because he felt it cemented partition. So there you have just some of the many faces of Richard Hayward pictured in a variety of acting and singing roles. A man who played many parts in many places and wore many hats as well. I think one of the things, just briefly on the filming, is you have to really remember this was the depressed 30s. There wasn't a lot of money around. People did want escapism and went to the pictures, they loved it. But my take on it is, if you look at today at the millions of pounds that go into Game of Thrones here, Hayward had nothing like that. There was no support really from anybody. He's made these himself, he's got his own actors, set up his own company. Getting the distribution was a complete nightmare for him, so he was doing it all himself. No support really from anybody. So when you put it into that sort of context, you can see it was quite an achievement in terms of what he did in the filmmaking world. And he turned from making feature films to making a number of travelogues based on journeys for his books. These were fact-based narratives in which he did the commentary. One was on the Shannon, one on the Corrib in the west of Ireland, and one on Kerry. So this is now going to take us on to the books that he wrote. I've divided this into two sections. The first one looks at his poetry, at a novel he wrote, and then the early travel books written during the Second World War. And the next section deals with his later travel books from the 1950s. Hands up who has read Richard Hayward's books? A few? Some of you might be familiar, but if not, just paint briefly the scene for those who aren't familiar. They're filled with history and the antiquities of the countryside, legends and folklore, the built heritage. He had a great interest in architecture, landscape description, especially the mountains. He was drawn to high places, and all sorts of other things, from complaining about the food in hotels to the people he met. But he started his writing career as a poet. Just look at this briefly. He published 3 books of poetry between 1917 and 1922. And this is the cover of one with a shamrock decorating the green boards. It was his second collection of poetry called Poems, published in 1920. And the poems were filled with the flowery diction of youthful exuberance, and there were expressions of love of the countryside as well as the love of life. They reflected the natural world around him. In his adolescent years on the Antrim coast, Island McGee gets a mention, the Goblins gets a mention, so Larne, that area, came into the equation in his poetry. They're quite well observed, but they don't appear to have taken the literary world by storm. For this collection, Hayward chose as a frontispiece a charcoal portrait sketched by Grace Henry, the wife of the artist Paul Henry. And one poem in this collection, A Praise of Connemara, is dedicated to Mr. and Mrs. Paul Henry. Although he published 3 collections, he decided then after some angst, poets are always angst-ridden, aren't they, eventually at some point, to give it up, really. He wanted to do other things. There's little critical reaction to his work, but after his death, one writer who praised his travel books said he was a damn bad poet, and he had the sense to know it. Some don't. The poems were forced for grandiose effect a little bit. Others were pretentious and artificial, and they reflected what you would call really the cloying sentimentality of adolescence. A bit of banal dialect in them, although I'm sure some people liked that at the time. So he tried his hand at fiction, and this is the cover jacket of his only novel, Sugar House Entry, published in 1936. And this is the story of a farming community in County Down. It was the name of an old alley in Belfast where there had been a sugar refining factory which was destroyed. It was destroyed in the Blitz in 1941. One of Belfast's leading bookshops, some of you might well have been in it in years gone by, Erskine Mains, ran a prominent window display to promote the book with its distinctive dust jacket. The same display also featured the English travel writer H.V. Morton's new book, In the Steps of St. Paul. Quite an interesting juxtaposition, I think, because Morton also wrote a book In Search of Ireland, published in 1929, that Hayward had read. One of the side things, Morton couldn't believe that they were actually building Parliament buildings at Stormont, because he thought partition wouldn't last, and he was astounded they were putting up this building. Morton was hugely popular and prolific. He worked for the Daily Express, and his books sold in their millions. Hayward's books sold well too, but not on that scale. They would have sold in their thousands. People wonder about book sales, but in Ireland in this period there weren't really all that many people buying books. Small country, he didn't really have the British or the American market that he would have needed. He tried to crack that. But Brendan Behan, who was writing around this time, once said, "The number of people who buy books in Ireland would not keep me in drink for the duration of Sunday opening time." In fact, Hayward's best-selling book was his first travel book, In Praise of Ulster, in 1938. And it had a very attractive sepia dust jacket featuring a Donegal scene drawn by James Humbert Craig, and it was an instant success. The title was both in English and Irish. It was acclaimed by the critics and was a Book Society choice. And Craig produced 48 wash drawings, including this sketch of turf cutters in Cushendun in the Glens. This was the area where Craig lived and worked as a painter. But he spent time in Donegal and Connemara painting, and he was highly respected as a landscape painter. We'll just look at a few of these sketches briefly to give a flavour. This is the Watergate in Enniskillen, County Fermanagh, beside the museum. I like this one because I think it's quite evocative. It's the busy port market in Monaghan town in the mid-1930s. The book was reprinted 4 times, and in the wartime reprint, the illustrations from Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal, with one exception, were all dropped. You can imagine getting paper. Students couldn't get paper for their studies. To get paper to produce high-quality books, which is what he did. These were produced by Dundalgan Press in Dundalk. Harry Tempest was a craftsman in the way of book production, and just to get the books produced alone was a major achievement, and he produced 3 books during the Second World War. This is Donegal's highest point, Errigal, where Hayward enjoyed walking along the giddy parapet of the one-man path at the summit. He had a great love for mountains. The permanencies of the landscape interested him very much, and he climbed all the highest mountains in Ireland, from Carrantoohil in the Mcgillicuddy's Reeks, Galtymore in Tipperary, where to this day there is a Richard Hayward memorial at the summit, Lugnaquilla, Wicklow, the Mourne Mountains, the Manturks in Connemara. He would have known them all. He also loved islands, and in particular the desolation of Torry in Donegal, where he found the people civil and kindly. He prescribed an antidote of an occasional sojourn against the madness of our restless mechanised days. 1938. Craig's sketch shows his sympathy for the boats and water. It was a leitmotif in his work. This just shows you the scale of the coverage he was getting. The Irish Independent chose In Praise of Ulster as its book of the month for July 1938. And the critic drew comparisons with Robert Lloyd Prager's book, The Way That I Went, which I'm sure will be known to some of you. I'd never heard of a comparison before with Hayward and Prager. Hayward had a different style of writing to Prager. Prager was a scientist and wouldn't have employed the same purple prose as Hayward did. He wouldn't have used the jargon, really, that Hayward used. That was not in any way to do down Richard Hayward as a writer. He was a fluent, intelligent, and thoughtful writer. He was highly regarded by the critics. He admitted using superlatives, slipping in jargon at times, which some critics didn't like, but the public liked it, and it was reprinted 4 times, so it was his most successful book. We'll go on to the Shannon region now, and this is an area that Hayward loved. This is the original receipt from August 39 for the hire of a Cheltenham caravan for his journey down the Shannon for his book Where the River Shannon Flows, and an accompanying travellogue. And they set out just about 2 weeks before the war broke out, August 1939. He makes some references to it, but not many. But it's quite amazing because all these wonderful pastoral descriptions of the countryside and the fact that the world was about to go to war again. It was quite a juxtaposition, really. It's the story of a road trip following the course of the river from its source at the Shannon Pot in Cavan to the sea at Ballybunion in Kerry. And it was a very successful book too, because he spotted a niche in the market. No one had ever really written about the Shannon in any detail. It's still in demand today by book collectors. The Sunday Times said the book was packed with the loot of the past. As well as a movie cameraman, then Hayward also travelled with the photographer Louis Morrison, and his black and white photographs were used in the book. This picture shows him with the Hanley and O'Hara families, who then were the only inhabitants on the Black Islands. This is a group of 7 islands on Loch Ree. And he said that Mrs. Hanley made them a grand meal of good strong tea, fresh boiled eggs and bread baked by herself, light as a feather and fit for a king. So he always got a little bit of hospitality when he was on the road. His next book was The Corrib Country, which came out in 1943 and was his 3rd Irish travel book. He again collaborated with Humbert Craig, who provided 38 wash drawings. Just a brief run through these. These are the Mamturk Mountains in Connemara, sketched by Craig. Gave them good opportunities to write and draw. This is Dancing at the Crossroads, which of course was a prominent feature of Irish country life in the 1940s. Craig's roadside dance captures the atmosphere. This is an 18th century folly which was built in an old domain near Cong in Mayo. It's called the Temple of the Nail, and it intrigued Hayward. He spent many hours trying to decipher the wording on it and referred to the structure as an ornamental faradiddle. He loved trying to work these things out, and then when he came back he might send them to an expert in the field who could help him work out what the inscriptions all meant. Corrib Country includes a section on Galway at the end of the book. Craig's sketch shows the Fowl and Butter Market outside St Nicholas's Collegiate Church. We continue our whistle-stop tour, moving on from Corrib to Kerry, and this is the dust wrapper of Hayward's 1946 book featuring a sketch of Loch Curran drawn by Theo Gracie. Gracie was a new artist who'd signed up as Craig died in 1944. They spent 5 weeks touring Kerry in summer of that year and then went back in 1945 to get more material, so you can appreciate the vast amount of research that the man did for his travel writing. He was a serious, he took it very seriously in terms of doing the advance work and the research and getting the stories on the ground. It's a very big book. This is 350 pages. This is Margaret Lane in Killarney, one of a total of 109 sketches by Gracie. The natural world played a part in Hayward's travel writing. He described the gannets near the Skelligs as soaring and gliding and standing still. Extraordinarily lovely in the air, the bird fell like a streamlined bomb. Next one is Mount Brandon. Anybody ever climbed it in Kerry? No? Not yet, anyway. This, as I said earlier, he loved the mountains, and in the foreground here, in the front of this picture, is 9-year-old Ricky. This is Richard Hayward's son was Richard, but he was known as Ricky. He's coming up to 80 years of age. He'll be coming to the symposium next Friday, and speaking a little bit about his father. So this is Richard Hayward and two guides following behind them. So he would have taken his son, he had two sons, one was a bit older, he would have taken his son and wife with him on some of his trips. This was the summer, so they were there for part of the journey, but most times he left them behind at home. Theo Gracie collaborated with Hayward in this book, as I mentioned. Hayward had quite a difficult time with him, and he had a difficult time with some of the other artists too. He described him as a hopeless procrastinator, more interested in playing poker than drawing sketches. So we'll move on now to the second series, as it were. This is called the This Is Ireland series, the second set of books. He had in mind to write a big book about all of Ireland, but he decided that it was too big a country to come up with one book, so he decided to split it into 5 books. Although there's 4 provinces, he gave Comet 2 books. And this was a very long project that started in 1948 and ended in 1964. There was a big gap for a variety of reasons towards the end. But the dust jacket for his first book in the series, Leinster and the City of Dublin, featured Raymond Piper's colour drawing of Dunamase Castle in County Laois. The book was published in 1949, and the Times Literary Supplement described Hayward as an unrepentant romantic, hence the title of next Friday's symposium. Another reviewer likened his work to that of the 19th century English travel writer George Borrow, which is very apt because Hayward had been influenced by George Borrow's writing when he was about 19 or 20. This book marked the start of a long relationship with the Belfast artist Raymond Piper. Some of you probably knew him. He was considerably younger than him, and he was just starting out in his artistic career at this stage. This picture was taken in 1985. Hayward met him through the Belfast Naturalist Field Club, and he liked his work. Piper had actually sketched Praeger. In fact, I knew Raymond quite well, and he told me he'd sketched Praeger twice. Once when Raymond was 24 and Praeger was 84. So 60 years separated the two of them, and I'd never met anybody who'd met Praeger until I met Piper, because he's one of the men in my gallery of heroes. They started their journey in Dublin, and Piper's evocative drawing of St Auden's Arch and the church tower just gives you a flavour of the style that is completely different obviously to Craig and to Humbert Craig. The arch was the only remaining gateway in the old city walls. A favourite haunt of Hayward's was the Brazen Head, a bar near the Dublin Quays, which Piper captured in shadow in one of his many sketches. The inn appears on some of the oldest maps in Dublin, and it was the meeting place of the United Irishmen. This is the Casino at Marino in Dublin, which was entreated on the advice of the architectural historian and inspector of monuments in the Republic, Harold Leask. Hayward sent his manuscript to him. He was a very well-known writer of his time, and he helped Hayward by reading through the manuscript, making suggestions, and said, you really have to put this building in it. So he took his advice and he did it. This is a sketch of Mount Leinster, the highest point in Wexford and Carlow. Again, the high places gave them sketch opportunities. We'll go on through these. This is Carlow Castle in the River Barrow, sketched by Piper, and this is the Shannon at Athlone with the castle and the Church of St Peter and St Paul, which Hayward felt lent a kind of alien charm to a very humdrum place. This is the Newgrange burial chamber. Hayward and Piper spent time exploring antiquities, old relics, as I think Raymond liked to call them, all over Leinster. His sketch shows the inside of the chamber at Newgrange, which is County Meath. Hayward described it as one of the most important prehistoric monuments in the world. So the next book in the series was Ulster and the City of Belfast. This was published in 1950. So this was the second book on Ulster we had in praise of Ulster. It was really a rewrite of that book, updating it with the aftermath of the Second World War, where so much had been destroyed in Belfast, and it reflected changes in that area, the city and the countryside, and it was reduced considerably in size. This is the Antrim Coast Road again, getting some more coverage. Just a sketch or two from this. This is Piper's pencil drawing of a section of the city walls in Derry with the 5 London cannon on display. Hayward described Derry as a holy city, a remembrancer, a rallying place, and anything but a collection of bricks and mortar. And another one here is Knockmany Chambered Cairn at Oher in Tyrone, which Piper drew. This was a very good place to drink in the layers of the landscape for Hayward. He'd been here first in the 1920s with the Belfast Naturalist Field Club. I'd first visited this cairn. It's now closed in. Some of you have probably been there. It's now closed, but it was open in those days. And it gave him great sweeping views over South Ulster and beyond. The third book in this series then is Comet and the City of Galway, which was published in 1952. The High Cross at Tuam in Galway adorns the cover. The book is mostly Galway city and county, which is why he needed a second book to cover the other Comet counties. Hayward's name was accidentally omitted from the title page of this book. The publishers, Arthur Barker in London, apologised for this mistake. In his own copy, and this is his own signed copy, he put his name, signed his name with a copper-plate hand on the space where it should have been printed. He wasn't very happy. Hell hath no fury like a writer whose name has been left out of their title page. Next is Lynch's Castle in Galway, which Hayward wrote as the one single example of what the city must have looked like before the curse of Cromwell fell upon it. You have the women in their shawls here. Further along, of course, those of you who know Galway, was Kenny's bookshop, which he frequented. I used to know Maureen Kenny, who was the matriarch and ran the shop, and she would have known Hayward very well. She died a few years ago, but I spoke a couple of years ago to Des Kenny, her son, and he told me about Hayward coming in. His mother had told him Hayward would come in, he would look around the shelves. It was a huge shop, went up 3 or 4 floors away back, and he'd take notes and he'd ask her questions. He had a great curiosity, and then she said he would go down to the Wolf Tone Bridge and look out over the River Corrib for hours on end. And she didn't know what he was thinking about, and we don't know either, unless any of you do. He was probably conjuring up a few sentences in his head. In any form of writing, as most of you are aware, there's a lot of thinking time. So he was thinking about his books, possibly, and exactly the same he did from the top of those mountains, where he spent a lot of time as well, just drinking in the layers of the countryside. This is the short story writer, Padraig O'Connor, done by Albert Parr. His statue was in Eyre Square. It's now in the Galway National Museum. Hayward called him a fine Irish novelist and storyteller. Galway, he wouldn't have known him. I don't think Hayward would have known him because he died in 1928, and he mostly wrote in Irish. Richard Hayward claimed to read and speak in Irish. I think it was more a bit of show, really. I'm not sure about his linguistic ability in terms of being fluent in it, but he would have been able to pass himself. Delia Murphy would have known O'Connor, and she met him many times actually in Galway. She got songs from him and stories. This is the distinctive blue dust jacket of his second book on Comet, Mayo, Sligo, Leitrim, Roscommon, published in 1955, and the fourth in the series. This book has had a very small print run, and is now the rarest and most collectible of all in the topographical series. So if you come across a copy, keep it. Don't sell it just yet. The former world heavyweight boxing champion Gene Tunney became friendly with Hayward. He's seen here leaning on Yeats's grave in Sligo in this sketch by Raymond Piper. Tunney's mother came from Mayo, and he came to Ireland with his American friends several times, and he went on tour with Hayward and Piper, and they toured all over Comet. And Piper sketched them at Yeats's grave, Drumcliff. Hayward's on the left of the drawing, and Tunney is leaning on the gravestone. Hayward met Yeats. He met Yeats on one occasion at a function in Dublin, but according to Ricky Hayward, the poet didn't take a blind bit of notice of him. He obviously didn't show him any of his poetry, but we don't know. This is the monastic settlement on the island of Inishmurray, County Sligo, which Hayward and Piper visited in 1952 with the local historian Bob Kerwin. Something about the spirit of the place moved him greatly, and he was enchanted by the medieval wooden statue of saints. Its recent history was fresh with the locals, as the government evacuation scheme was just the previous year. There's a wonderful 10-page description of, really, he was giving his emotional response to this place. It's a tremendous piece of writing. for example, in the classroom, in the school, the chalk was still on the blackboard. And this just had an impact on him, a wonderful description of what it was like. This is Carrick-on-Shannon. It was a great favourite place of Richard Hayward's, Carrick-on-Shannon in Leitrim. And he's seen here in Piper's sketch, the tail goes round. This is Dunn's Bar, and this appeared in Mayo Sligo, Leitrim, Roscommon. The bar has been renovated, but the sketch now hangs on a wall. It's still there, and it's one of the few tangible pieces of evidence about Hayward to be found anywhere in Ireland. He was made a freeman of Carrick-on-Shannon, which I don't think had any official status. Maybe even been done in this bar for all we know, but it was in recognition of his work in promoting the inland waterways of Ireland, because he did a huge amount of work to promote the Shannon and that area. So that was an acknowledgement really of it. We'll move on just to the final book. This is Munster and the City of Cork, with the clock gate at Youghal in East Cork on the cover. Published in September 1964, and as I said, it's the 5th volume in the This Is Ireland series. There was quite a gap between that and the previous one, 55, because he was so busy doing so many other things. Just show you a couple of sketches briefly to finish this section. Blossom's Gate in Kilmallock, County Limerick, one of the last 5 original town gates. This is the east face of the 3rd High Cross at Kilfenora in County Clare, which had only recently been discovered when they found it in 1960. Piper's sketch of the cliffs of Moher in County Clare. Hayward described the cliffs as the most sublime scenery of the whole of our ocean-torn Western Ocean. And if you have ever been to the Burren, will know the Pull na Brone Dolmen Stone, south of Ballyvaughan, which Hayward called a most impressive example of its class. Field club trips and orange songs, these are linked for convenience. I don't know if he sang orange songs on the field club trips. He might well have done, of course, but they're from around the same period, so that's why I've lumped them together. The first photograph, I have to go back actually to the 1920s, so this is the field club on a summer outing in 1923 to Duncrew Fort at Woodburn near Carrickfergus. Hayward joined the club in 1921 at the age of 29, and he was stimulated very much by the company of older members, because this is, you could think this is a Victorian era photograph almost, I think. You can't really see him, but he's near the back wearing a bow tie with his hands on his knees. He was also a member of the Antiquaries, that is the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland. Seen here in their Sharabang, preparing to set off from Belfast outside the Robinson and Cleaver building for their summer 1924 outing. They were on their way to the Giant's Ring, the largest henge and stone circle in Ireland. And I think this is a wonderful photograph. It's buried away in a field club scrapbook. And Hayward is the one in the centre. You can see him hatless, a rare occasion for him not to have a hat. Seated in the centre of the vehicle, cutting quite a distinctive figure in a faraway reverie. He's the only person in the picture not looking at the photographer, Albert Campbell. So the Antiquaries were going to the Giant's Ring, and this is just a group photograph of them. Hayward's in the centre of this. You can just probably make him out there. In the bottom of it, you can't really see him, but I just put it in because it was with this photograph, is the archaeologist, Professor R.A.S. Mcallister. He was president of the Antiquaries in 1924, and he led this tour to the Giant's Ring. And Mcallister became friendly with Hayward, and for many years supported him in his writing, helping him check factual queries on the history and significance of antiquities and inscriptions. Hayward described him as a never-failing mine of information, guidance, and heart-warming courtesy. After his death, Mcallister left his entire library to Richard Hayward, so that would be quite a collection of books that he had. On to the 1950s, and Hayward became president of the Belfast Naturalist Field Club in 1951. In his presidential year then, he led a large group of members of the club on their weekend excursion to Kilkenny at Easter in '52. This was one of the first ever cross-border excursions. The Irish Times described the weekend as a friendly invasion from the north, and Hayward was helped on the ground by Hubert Butler, who's a well-known essayist and local antiquarian who was involved with the Kilkenny Archaeological Society. This is just members of the field club preparing to leave for South Donegal at Easter. 1955. Brendan Adams is in the picture here, third from the left, I think, in this one. Together with Brendan Adams, they set up a folklore and dialect section in the field club, and they collected 9,000 words and phrases. They sent out these questionnaires all over to farmers, fishermen, retired civil servants, teachers, lighthouse keepers, anybody, but they were overwhelmed with a vast collection of words. Hayward felt it was very important to preserve these phrases that were dying out because of radio, cinema, television and everything else. And it was a very successful project. He had in mind to publish a dictionary. It wasn't published in his lifetime, but it was published in 1996 when it was taken on by the Oxford University Press. The archive of it went to the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum, who took it over, and that's where you can still see it to this day. The questionnaires are there. This is the field club preparing to lining up for the camera as they set off from Belfast on the Enterprise to Dublin for onward connection to the Burren. This was 1956. Richard's there with Elma. He's standing, he's the man with the hat, and Elma's behind him, and behind him is a smiling Raymond Piper. Kerry was the field club's destination for spring 1958, and this group photograph was taken at the front of Kate Kearney's cottage at the Galway Low on Easter Saturday, 5th of April. Partly obscuring the sign are Hayward and, again, his nephew, the linguist Brendan Adams. We're going to move on just to look at another book from the one other photograph. This is Hayward at in his tweeds about to lead a group off again, in front of the City Hall. They're going to Sligo. And you can see women of a certain age, as you might say, who were wanted to go off with him and enjoy the weekend. He was very popular as a tour conductor, but the field club divided into two camps, and there were the botanists, the scientists, and the academics who carried out serious field study and who took it all pretty seriously. And then there were the amateurs, such as Hayward, although I don't know if it's fair to call him an amateur, because he could take you to the Burren and he could name all the wildflowers and give you all the Latin names of them. And as one man said to me, who was on it, if he didn't know them all, he might make up a couple. But that didn't matter to these women. They didn't really want too much detail on the geological age of the glacial erratics. I mean, a little of that would have gone a long way with them. They wanted to go because he was taking the tour. It didn't matter where the destination was. They wanted to be in his company. They loved his conversation, they loved his crack, and it was a bit of an outing for them, I suppose you could say. Some of them would have been spinsters. There were some men went on them too, of course, but you had to sign up early for them, and they fought to get sitting beside him in the bus. But he had his detractors, and this is one of them, Patricia Kirkland, who was a field botanist and curator of the herbarium at Queen's and lecturer in the botany department. This sketch of her was done by Raymond Piper. She was dismissive of Hayward and thought that she just thought him frivolous. She referred to the women who went on the excursions as Hayward's pussies, dismissing some of them as flibberty gibbets. And she was quite forthright in her opinions, and as a professional scientist, she thought he was in the club through sheer forceful personality, and she disregarded his researches. That Hayward she would proclaim and disgust, so she took against him as being a lightweight. He wasn't fulfilling her expectation of what a member should be, and the fact that he had such a loyal following of women who hung on to his every word annoyed her even more. Another example of how he was viewed by the academic side comes from Eston Evans. Eston Evans' son, who I spoke to, Alan Evans. Eston Evans, of course, a brilliant geographer, Mourne country and Irish heritage. Amongst his books, he would have known Richard Hayward very well through the field club, and he viewed him with what his son called a tone of friendly disdain. You see, the popularity that he had annoyed academics. Some historians didn't like him, some musicians didn't like him, for a variety of reasons. One man told me that the musicians were waiting for him to fall flat on his face. The reason for that being they wanted the big band stuff that was coming in from America. Hayward was playing this traditional Irish music, which they thought was trash or orange ballads. We don't need any of that, we want the big band stuff. So he was popular with many thousands of people, but what I've been trying to do is present a rounded picture of him, just to get the rounded figure. I'm going to move on to look at another book from the 50s, Border Foray, published in 1957 with a wonderful sketch of Piper. He had a bit of fun with the cover of this. There's some scantily clad dancing girls on it, and Hayward is caricatured in the centre playing the harp. It's based on a journey along the border and is the most political of all his books. He made a decision really not to go into politics in his books. He felt there were enough people writing about politics in Ireland and he wasn't going to add anything more to it. So it's mostly, as I said, the cultural history, landscape, the people, the stories, the legends, the folklore, and so much more. But the IRA's border campaign had started in 1957. It's exactly the same week as he started his journey, so he did make a reference to it. He couldn't really have ignored it. And there were some very strong pro-unionist comments, which was unusual, as I said, because there were no political material in his other books. He steered clear of politics and he boasted about that fact. Since partition, he had frequently crossed and recrossed the border. And in his Ulster book, he complained that it was an infernal nuisance and a dreadful bugbear. It is bad enough for any of us, especially if we have been used to roaming about with let or hindrance since childhood, because he'd visited Donegal in his childhood. So again, no book on the border. He saw a niche, move in there, write a book on the border, and that's what he achieved. It was quite a successful book. Around this time, he was also active then in recording the Orange records, which I mentioned briefly earlier. These were produced in the 1950s. He had collected these songs in the 1920s, along with the traditional Irish ones, and recorded them in the 20s, 30s, 40s with Decca. This cover shows Hayward's Orange and Blue, released by Beltona, and it was chosen by Gramophone magazine as one of the top 6 recordings in the UK in 1956. It mentions, as you can see there, the Loyal Brethren. Hayward loved telling people that this was a group of 6 musicians, including Sean Maguire, but Hayward was the only Protestant member of the group. The other 5 were all Catholics. So this gave it what you might call a wider appeal, I suppose, in many respects. One man that I interviewed about 50 people for my research on Richard Hayward, and one man said to me, my hearing's not great some days, and he's, I think, about 87. He said Richard Hayward was toothpaste. And I was puzzling and wondering, what do you mean? No, I mean two-faced. So there's a mishearing on my part. But I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, he was a Hibernian one day and he was an Orange man the next day. And he followed the money. You know, I go back to what I said earlier, he had no university, newspaper, museum, broadcasting organisation behind him. He was his own man and he had to go where he could earn money. And he joined the Orange Order in 1957, which was quite late on in life because he was 65, and you wonder why didn't he join it earlier if he felt so strongly about espousing their views. He was a unionist in his outlook. He would have been classified as a Gladstonian liberal in his views. He didn't sign the Ulster Covenant in 1912, I have checked it in this very building, but there was a hardening of attitudes around this time because of the border campaign, partly I guess, and I think he would have seen joining the Orange Order as a business opportunity. We would call it networking today, perhaps. But he joined it anyway and you know, entered into the spirit of it with them, attended dinners and got closely involved with the activities of it. This is just a shot of a Decca flyer from the ballads that he'd been recording. He recorded several Orange songs in the 50s as well, but most of them have been done earlier. And we're going to look really at the Orange sash. This is his own Eldon Lodge collarette. The lodge he joined was Eldon Lodge number 7, and named after Lord Chancellor Eldon. This was regarded as the elite of all the Orange Order lodges, and its membership consisted of leading businessmen, industrialists, wine merchants, retired army colonels. Brian Faulkner, future Prime Minister, was a member. Robin Kinahan was in it. Very, very good to have friends in those sorts of places. And he entered into the spirit of it. They formed a lodge of research, and he was carrying out work in the history of the institution with a view to publishing a record of the sounds of marching bands at the 12th parades. And they recorded a lot of that material on the 11th of July in Sandy Row, the noise of the bands, the children, all the bonfires. And it didn't get published in his lifetime. It was produced posthumously in 1965 by Roy Dixon, a folk singer from Ballymoney, who took it over to finish it. But he'd started the work for it. As well as producing the records, then he brought out an Orange Standard sheet music book, published in '58 and containing 18 of his best-known Orange and Irish songs. So there's a mix in that. The final section, just to move on to finish, is really looking at his business, which I haven't, apart from the cultural activities, and that was business of course, but there were other sides to it. For most of his adult life, Richard Hayward worked part-time as a confectionery salesman for 2 sweet companies. He spent 40 years as a commercial sales rep with Fox's Glacier Mints. And Foxes were well known all over, and this is Peppy, the polar bear. Some useless information for you. Peppy appeared on their sweet bag wrapper in 1921, the year before Hayward joined the company. He became known to some of his friends as the Glacier Mints Man. That's what they do in this country. They love giving you little sobriquets and nicknames if you feel you're getting too high up, you know, like knocking you off. So the other company was Needler's Chocolates of Hull, and he worked for them for 39 years, 2 days a week, selling sweets. All of this produced regular income when the artistic endeavours weren't making him a vast amount of money. As I said, not that many people were buying books in Ireland in the 30s and 40s, even 50s. But his son has told me that this helped pay for summer holidays in the 1950s when they travelled to France and Spain and other parts of Europe. And he did quite a bit of travelling abroad then. This is just a photograph of Molly Quinn, who was a friend of his. I put a letter in the Irish Times and the Irish Examiner about a year and a half ago asking if anybody knew about Hayward to contact me, and 27 people wrote to me from all over Ireland, including a retired doctor from Liverpool. This was his aunt, Molly Quinn, and he told me a great story about her. She ran a pharmacist in Baggot Street in Dublin. He said she was infatuated with Hayward. She couldn't get enough of his company. He would come to Dublin, he'd be going off touring somewhere, she would close up her chemist shop, jump in the car and head off with him to the west, probably the Burren or Shannon region or somewhere. And she just thought he was always full of interest and wonderful conversation. And she went with him to Spain. That's Richard on the left, Molly Quinn and Elma on the right. He had in mind to write a book about Spain. He was quite a Hispanicist, and nothing came of it, but he brought her along as a translator, and he did write several articles about Spain and his interest in the country and its cultural history and heritage. This is a proud moment for him when he received an honorary degree from Lafayette College in Pennsylvania in 1959. The doctorate was awarded for distinguished services to Irish literature and in recognition of his contribution to the development and spread of Irish literature. He was very closely involved with the PEN group, the writing organisation, and Hayward is pictured here with friends from the literary and artistic world. The Dublin painter Cecil Salkeld is on the left, then Hayward, then Compton Mcentee, co-founder of Gramophone magazine, which reviewed many of Hayward's records, and the Irish novelist Maurice Walsh is standing on the extreme right. He of course wrote the original Quiet Man story. Maurice Walsh was a great champion of Hayward's work. He wrote the foreword to 3 of his travel books. He reviewed his books for the Irish Times. He was a major supporter of his writing. And Maurice Walsh didn't need to be. His own books sold in their millions. Now, he was an example of somebody who was selling books in millions in those middle decades of the 20th century. This is the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Lord Brookborough, stoking the model engine Donegal as Hayward looks on, fag in hand. He did take on many public roles, including serving as a member of the museum committee, though he was never a trustee of the New Folk Museum, and he was very annoyed about this. But he was a great supporter of it, and was involved in the early stages of it in terms of helping to get the museum up and running in the mid-50s, I guess, around that period. This is father and son, Ricky and Richard, on O'Connell Bridge. Ricky was educated at Newtown School in Waterford, a Quaker school that they sent him off to there, and this is just after the Second World War. This picture was taken by Arthur Fields. He was a Ukrainian Jew and very well-known street photographer who snapped tens of thousands of passers-by on the bridge from the 1930s to 1985. He operated a 2-camera policy. So he would pretend to take a snap off you if you walked past with a dud camera, and then if you said you didn't want it, that was okay. Then he said you did want it, he would sign them up again, bring up a new camera and take another photograph of them. So that's the story. There's a new book being written about him coming out this autumn. Newtown School was a Quaker school which he attended as a boarder from 1945 to 1952. This sketch appeared in the Munster book, and Hayward liked the ethos of the school. So much, in fact, that he became a member of the Newtown Old Scholars Association himself, This was a man who was a leading light in the old grammarians of Larne. Reunions. This is the prefects group, including Ricky Hayward, he's in the middle row on the right-hand side. And there's another photograph of them here where he's acting. This is the school play, She Stoops to Conquer. And Ricky on the extreme right played the role of Tony Lumpkin. He didn't go on to have an acting career. He did other things in acting, but he was having a go. Entering into the spirit of the festivities of the Galway Oyster Festival, Hayward is pictured second right. Here, Galway was a great place, he was a regular visitor there. Hayward's on the left of this picture in the Irish Times, along with Lady French at the Galway Oyster Festival in 1961. Could anybody identify the man in the photograph on the right putting the oyster into the woman's mouth? Who's that? Any takers? No, that is a young Charles Haughey cavorting with Hayward at the Galway Oyster Festival. We had De Valera earlier. He was then Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Justice, and he's helping his wife to eat the first oysters of the season. These are the guests at the Claddagh Coach in Galway. So after his wife died, Elma died of cancer in 1961. Richard Hayward remarried the next year, and this is the wedding party at his second marriage to Dorothy Gamble at Duncairn Presbyterian Church, Belfast, on the 23rd of February 1962. Raymond Piper, as ever in the photograph, is standing behind the newly married couple. He was best man. The marriage was solemnised in the presence of Ricky Hayward and his wife Mary on the extreme left of the photograph. This is a poignant photograph of Hayward and Dorothy, pictured shortly after their marriage. The Ford Anglia was the car in which he was travelling in which he was killed in a road accident in October 1964. And Hayward travelled the back roads of many parts of Ireland. This photograph of him is in a sports car taken on the Strathonahar Pass in County Fermanagh for a summer 1958 travel feature for Ulster Illustrated. And he's pictured here on the Derrygonney to Garrison Road in West Fermanagh. So this is a man who drove around Ireland for the best part of 40 years. And the newspaper front pages on the morning of the 14th of October 1964 tell the harrowing story of the crash in which Hayward was killed and two other people were also killed. He had a heart attack, car crossed the road and drove into another car. Just done this to show you the scale. It was on the front page of every newspaper in Ireland, and it was the scale of how well known the man was, and that's really why I put these up, just to show you. The Irish News, the Irish Independent gave it equal prominence. The Dublin papers had it on the front pages, and it sent shock waves around Ireland. People couldn't believe it or accept it that this man, who'd been such a prominent figure for 40 years and was known to thousands of people all over Ireland, had met his end in such a tragic way. And I've always thought it's just such a cruel irony for a man like this to be killed in a road accident. And as I said, probably since the late 1920s, he would have had a car, could have been driving around Ireland for the best part of, 35 years anyway. So, rather than ending on a sad note, we'll end with just two other photographs. One is a favourite of mine, no prizes for guessing the name of the actress. You all know Maureen O'Hara. Photographed on the set of The Quiet Man in 1951, reading Richard Hayward's Coral Country. We're not quite sure how she got her hands on the book. Cynics say he might have been floating around looking to get a part in the film and plunked the book into her hands. We don't know for certain. But an arrangement of Hayward's song, The Humour Is On Me Now, will be known to some of you, I'm sure. He sang that with Delia Murphy as well, but in The Quiet Man, this arrangement of his song was used, but he was never really properly credited with it in the acknowledgements. It's a wonderful photograph. I convinced Lilliput Press in Dublin to use it on the back cover of the book because it's just such a stunning image. Finally, a portrait of Richard Hayward painted by his great friend Raymond Piper in 1961. They spent many years together. I knew Raymond probably since the mid-80s or the late 80s. I got to know him quite well, and I'd always tap him for information about Hayward. To me, he was the link with him because he had been so much younger. And he'd always give me, some of you knew Piper, I'm sure, did you? Yeah, he died in 2007. He was a wonderful man. I'd go out with him for lunch sometimes, I'd have a coffee or a drink in his house, and you'd start him off about Richard Hayward, and then he would go off on a tangent about the awful state of the roads, the uselessness of our local politicians, the state of the NHS. I couldn't get him back onto Hayward, but I did get enough material from him to help me to paint the portrait and to illustrate him. But I asked him on one occasion, how did you get on together? You know, these were men who went to Munster for 3 months, all over Leinster, Comet, several visits. You know, they probably did get in each other's wick, is that the term? Annoy each other a little bit. And Raymond did indeed confirm that. In fact, I've seen letters in the late 40s for the first Leinster book. Hayward had a terrible time with Piper. He wanted to ditch him. I wrote to the publisher saying, this man is giving me headaches, I can't work with him, it's not working out. And they advised him to dump him. He didn't, he kept him on. But Raymond said to me when I asked him about how they got on, he said, we used to row like hell at times, as good friends do. After his death, then on the 13th of October 1964, a member of the Fermanagh Field Club wrote to his second wife to reflect on his life. And he summed it up, I feel, in just 10 words, which I'm going to finish with. He lit the fields of Ireland with a brilliant light. Thank you very much for your attention.